Affirmative.
And so we, it's sort of like a 2 or 3 pronged thing. The federal government wasn't going to move if the provincial government wasn't going to move, and if the provincial government wasn't going to move if the feds weren't going to move. And then we had all of the city of Vancouver and the municipalities in there.
Yep.
And they weren't going to give it up if they weren't going to cough up if the others weren't. And it was just a nightmare. And so everybody was bailing out saying, well, we're just not going to do it, we're not going to do it. And we said, this is bizarre.
Yep.
We can do it. This can be done. This is necessary. Look what it's going to do for the city. Look what the Port of Vancouver, with all the cruise ships coming in and a convention center and all the business we could bring in. We've got to do it. And so we started a campaign, a letter writing campaign, a petition campaign, and we had boxes and boxes and boxes of petitions.
Yep. Petitions.
Everybody in the community, we wrote up these petitions, and people came and got them, and then they filled them all out, and they kept bringing them back to us. In the meanwhile, while this was going on in the community, Gary, I think, interviewed everyone who was anybody. The labor people, the municipality people, the federal people, the provincial people, and kept pounding and pounding and pounding at all these people saying, will you get on board? Do you think we should have it? Are we going to do it? Where's it going to go? Are we going to get this put together? And finally, almost at the last hour, when we figured there was nothing going to happen and it was a miracle. We had announcements coming out our ears, and one got on board and the other one wasn't going to be left behind, and they were just like all together.
So which one came first? Feds, the provincial, or what?
I think it was the feds.
Okay.
Yeah. They weren't that far ahead of the provincial government, but I don't, honestly, Gary would know and he would remember. Yeah. I was still sorting out papers at that time, so I don't remember.
Well,
so I remember the old Pier BC down there. It was an ugly looking place, and now it's gorgeous. It's just a wonderful transformation.
We've had some really funny stories when we were doing media. Everybody's got wonderful stories, but this province was going down the tube because the unions were on strike. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, I remember when Jack Monroe made his trip to Kelowna.
He went up to the Kelowna to talk to the Premier, and all the media were scrambling. Webster and Bannerman were scrambling like crazy to get either Jack Monroe or the Premier, Bill Bennett. And so we were all working really hard to get them on our shows. And nobody could find Jack Monroe. Webster they'd found. Then he had agreed to go on with the Premier had agreed to go on. The Premier, Bill Bennett, had agreed to go on with Webster, and we were scrambling because we wanted Jack Monroe. We wanted, the Premier was going to come on with us after Webster, and we're saying, that's not good enough.
Those were the old days. Oh, yeah. If you were on Webster, you didn't get on Bannerman.
That was
if you were on
competition.
Bannerman, you didn't get on Webster.
We were first. My logic was, we're first or we're not at all. And I maintained that for years and years. That doesn't happen now, but that's what I said. If we're not first, then we're not at all, so forget it. So a lot of people would come to us first and then sort of do other stuff. But anyway, so this one particular morning, we knew Webster was going on air, and I had just flown back from a trip in Mexico, and Gary phoned and said, we need to find Monroe. Don't you even come near this place until you find him. And I said, where the hell am I going to find Monroe? Right? Where am I going to find him? What Gary didn't know. What Gary didn't know was Jack Monroe knew that everybody was going to be hounding him and looking for him, and he didn't know what to do. And he was living in West Van, and I was living in West Van. And he got off the plane, and he phoned me. And I had just arrived at 4 o'clock in the morning from Mexico. He got off the plane, and he phoned me, and he said, what are you doing? And I said, I just got in from Mexico. Why? He said, can I hide out for a couple of hours? And I said, what? Because I didn't know what was going on. And he said, the media are chasing me like crazy. I can't. I've made a commitment. I cannot go on the air until Webster starts to talk. And I said, fine. So I couldn't tell Gary at that time. And so there was Monroe sitting in my kitchen. I'm feeding him coffee. And Gary's saying to me, you've got to find him. You've got to find him. And I said, I just got off. You've got to find him. We've got to have him on the air. So, and Monroe was sitting there going. So I said, don't worry about it, you know, I'll find him. So what we did was we waited, and then I took Monroe down to the station, and we went in through the back door and up, and he was on the air with Gary right after, immediately after Webster went on the air. So those are the kinds of things you have to be very careful with. But had he been in public, Monroe wouldn't have had a hope in hell in getting to our show.
Right.
Because he'd have been, you know, there would have been a scrum.
Mobbed.
There'd have been a scrum, and he would have not gotten there, but we got him first. Anyway, we got a lot of stuff. We did a lot of stuff like that, but.
Well, those were some of the good stories. They were the things that what I always liked was when I'm trying to remember his name right now. He became fisheries minister. Tom Siddle, not Tom Siddle. Tom Siddle. Siddle was out in Richmond, and he was just a nice guy. And then I'm down at the NW studios at the Expo grounds, after Expo, and suddenly these two black limousines pull out, and Tom Siddon gets out with about 15 executive assistant hangers-on carriers for this briefcase, and he was Minister of Fisheries, I think, at the time, and goes upstairs, up to the studio. How you've seen so many people, because we won't talk about how long you've been in media now. Didn't you? I gotta just remind myself again. Didn't you at one time do the farm broadcasts in Ottawa for CBC?
Yes. The Hog Report.
The Hog Report.
Pork bellies.
The futures, the
pork belly futures and all sorts of interesting stuff, I would bet.
Are we having fun?
Hey.
Yeah, that was a couple of years ago.
We can make a book up about this program. It's
well, we're going to make a website off of it.
Those were the days. That's when I first got started with broadcasting. I'm an accountant that's what I do.
Yes,
well, I was just going to bring that out next. I was going to. You brought it up. You beat me to it.
So in my early days, I went to, my interest has always been, well, my really early interest was acting. And of course, my father thought I was an idiot because you don't make any money at acting, and I wouldn't be any good at acting. And so he said, you're going to have to be a singer. This goes way back, I mean, many, many years. You're going to have to sing. He was a pianist, and he wanted me to learn to sing. And so every Saturday, I had to go and take voice. And I never figured, I never really knew what the voice lessons would do for me. I never gave it a thought when I was that age. But every Saturday I had to take a streetcar because we were in Ottawa, and go and take voice lessons and then go home. And all the other kids were going to movies and doing stuff, and I wasn't allowed. But anyway, that passed. I wanted to act, and I wanted to do that sort of stuff, and he wouldn't allow it. And he said, when I would have to be a secretary, or I would have to learn to do something useful. Because in those days, not a lot of women worked, as you know.
Yep. Yes.
And so he was determined that I was going to do something useful. So I went to business college, and I took that, you know, the sort of business stuff. And
Pittman College or something like that? Or
Willis
was it
Business, Willis Business
okay.
College.
Yeah.
Willis Business,
so you learned how to type?
I learned how to type. I learned how to do shorthand. Pittman shorthand.
Shorthand.
I wouldn't know how to do Pittman now. Then I learned to do, you know, all the accounting machines and all that sort of stuff. And that was stupid stuff. But anyway, I was doing what I was supposed to do. And then I got involved with the CBC. Well, first of all, I worked for Central Mortgage and Housing.
CMHC.
Oh, I didn't know that. This is the first time I've heard that you were a CMHC
I worked for CMHC,
person.
but I was an assistant or an associate editor for a magazine because.
So internal house organ type of thing, or
yeah. So that's where I sort of got interested in journalism and that kind of stuff, and I took a bunch of courses and learned how with television how to do cutaways, and I mean I just loved doing that sort of stuff. So I'd be doing TV.
Pretty close to acting.
Yeah, kind of.
And your voice lessons probably helped an awful lot.
Well, and I think that's what happened because I was in CBC. I was
that
at
very moment she gets a frog in her chest, a French
So I
Canadian.
was with the CBC doing accounting work, and I hated doing it. I mean, I had to do it because that's what I had, ended up learning.
You'd admitted that you knew how, and that's what they figured
I
you
did
could
payroll,
do,
but
yes.
what I also was doing was I was negotiating with the guild and negotiating with the various. What was the music one? The AFM? No, yeah, AFM.
Yeah.
And negotiating with them and paying performers' salaries and stuff like that, and I hated it. And then someone said, "There's a job."
Why don't you go on air?
Someone said, "Yeah." First of all, somebody said, "You've got a great broadcast voice." I said, "Yeah, sure." And they said, "Well, why don't you come and try doing some production work?"